Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Phil Goldberg, and I'm welcoming you on behalf of the other board members of ASI. We're really delighted that so many of you signed up today, and that's an indication that we have chosen a good topic, an important topic. It's one many of us have been talking about, especially the last couple of years, but in spiritual communities, the quality of critical thinking and of discernment, or viveka, as the yogis put it, has always been a highly valued attribute, one to be taken seriously and employed as a practice on the spiritual path. And at the same time, we're very aware that many people on the spiritual path don't take it seriously or even degrade the use of the intellect because we're very aware of its limitations, which has left many people vulnerable to cultishness and suspension of critical thinking in making choices, and being susceptible to misinformation and manipulation. And so we feel this is a very important topic, especially these days. And we have with us two terrific speakers. They will each give a presentation for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. First to come is Jules Evans. Jules is a practical philosopher and the author of books that include Philosophy of Life and Other Dangerous Situations and The Art of Losing Control. He's an honorary research fellow at the Center for the History of the Emotions at Queen Mary University of London. And Dan Wilson, who will follow, is a scientist and science communicator who earned his PhD in biological sciences at Carnegie Mellon University. He has a day job as a scientist, but his passion is science communication, where many of you might know him from his YouTube channel, Debunk the Funk with Dr. Wilson. So, Jules, perhaps you can begin.
Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you to the association for inviting me. I'm honored to join, and great to meet you all. I'm going to use some slides. I'm just going to share my screen here. That's hopefully working okay. And I'm going to talk for, about 20-25 minutes. So the topic we're talking about is critical thinking and discernment in spirituality, which obviously is a big old topic to cover in 20 minutes. It's one of the oldest questions in philosophy, the relationship between rationality and ecstasy, between the ideal and the actual. And it goes all the way back to the kind of earliest days of philosophy, to Plato and Aristotle. It's an issue I've grappled with myself for years. My first book was about the kind of Socratic approach to flourishing, but then that was followed up with a book about ecstatic experiences. And so I was really always been trying to balance, or ask how we can balance and integrate the Socratic and the Dionysiac, the rational and the ecstatic. And I only have tentative ideas and suggestions, which I'll put forward. And I know there's a lot of wisdom and experience in the room, so I very much look forward to our discussion and to Dan's presentation as well. What I'm going to cover is, first of all, the immediate issue, then the longer term issues in our culture, and then 5 suggestions about how we might better enhance critical thinking and discernment. The immediate issue in our culture is that in the last 18 months of the pandemic, as you know, we've seen the spread of disinformation in New Age and wellness culture. Anti-vax sentiment, anti-mask disinformation, anti-lockdown disinformation, fake or at least overhyped cures for COVID, and far-right conspirituality like the QAnon conspiracy theory. And this by now has been well documented in CBS, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Vice, The Times. I wrote about it in April 2020. I wrote a piece called Conspirituality, which was reviving a term used in a paper back in 2011 by Charlotte Ward. And I've written other pieces on this topic since then. So like you, wondering what we can do and where does this phenomenon come from? It's a problem you find in every New Age hotspot around the world. Byron Bay, which by the way was the site of, it's so anti-vax historically, it's very kind of hippie place in Australia. And it's been the site of outbreaks of whooping cough because so many of the New Age seekers there are anti-vax. Santa Monica here in California, likewise, it was the site of an outbreak of measles in the last few years because there's so much anti-vax sentiment among the seekers there. You find it in Tulum in Mexico, in Glastonbury in my home country of England, where there have been fights between the masked and the unmasked in kind of health food shops. In Sedona, where I just was this week, in Crestone in Colorado. So wherever there are lots of New Age seekers, you're seeing a lot of anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-lockdown and conspirituality kind of sentiment. We've seen dispiritingly New Age, leading influences in the New Age and wellness space spreading disinformation, like Mickey Willis. And Mickey was at the January the 6th, violent demonstrations in Washington, along with this guy, the now notorious QAnon shaman, Jake Angeli, who became a kind of unwitting poster boy for New Age conspirituality. So this has really been, I think, for lots of us, embarrassing and dismaying, humiliating and dispiriting. It's kind of really the worst aspect in some ways of our culture has been all over the news. And we've been making this very challenging crisis for our species worse, arguably, in the last 18 months. And there are longer terms in our culture as well. The New Age has long been criticized for charlatanry, anti-intellectualism, cultishness, and a lack of discrimination. Theodore Roszak wrote in 1975, "It is spiritual intelligence the moment demands of us. Without it, the consciousness circuit will surely become a lethal swamp of paranormal entertainments, facile therapeutic tricks, authoritarian guru trips, and demonic subversions." So why these longer term chronic issues in our culture? So here are 6 brief possible reasons. First of all, the New Age emerged from border science, fringe science. It emerged as a reaction to the apparent triumph of Darwinian materialism in the 1860s. In the 1880s, you had what historians called the mystical revival. By its nature, border science is speculative. And that can lead to medical breakthroughs. So out of fringe science, we've had now evidence-proven cures like hypnosis or talking therapy or meditation or yoga or psychedelic therapy or somatic therapy. So a lot of good things can come from border science, but it can also lead to bullshit like the Reichian orgone boxes or breatharianism or the new fad of urine diets I've just been reading about, etc. and etc. Secondly, the Enlightenment pathologized non-rational states of consciousness, and Romanticism and the New Age sometimes overreacted in response, arguing that only intuition and ecstasy lead to truth, whilst rationality is the enemy. So turn off your mind, stop thinking. On the left, that's Goya's etching, "The sleep of reason produces monsters." So that kind of classic Enlightenment idea that anything non-rational just leads to delusion. Thirdly, the New Age is and has always been a deinstitutionalized bazaar. It's not a cathedral, it's decentralized. And that means there's not much in the way of institutional oversight or peer review. So that deinstitutionalized kind of structure encourages charismatic influences, over certainty, the hyping of your cure, and free market hustling. And we're all, to some extent, hustling in this field, including me. Sometimes those market pressures just lead to bad incentives, just to overhype your wares. Fourth, spiritual libertarianism. There's a strong libertarian streak in Romanticism and in 60s counterculture. All of the great hippie anthems were about personal freedom, about rejecting the rules. You think, why did Eric Clapton become an anti-vaxxer? Well, just look at his 70s song, I Feel Free. It's all there. So it's not really a surprise if some hippie culture should rebel against rules like lockdown rules. In a way, what we've seen in the last 18 months is a kind of spiritual tea party, New Age tea party. I wondered about calling it the DMT party, with people like JP Sears campaigning for their rights not to be, not to obey the rules on lockdowns and things. Fifth, esotericism easily leads to spiritual narcissism. Esoteric comes from the word for the few, esoterikoi. So it can lead to this kind of narcissistic idea, we few know the secret wisdom whilst everyone else is asleep. So that can be an issue. It can just lead to this rejection of anything mainstream and always the preference for the alternative news, alternative cures. And a final possible long-term reason is historians have talked about the two moods that you find in Gnosticism, in Romanticism, and the New Age. These two moods were first delineated by Francis Yates, the great historian of magic, and the philosopher Isaiah Berlin in his lectures on Romanticism. The first mood is a kind of ecstatic millenarianism. We are about to shift to a new golden age of love and mystical union and light, like in the kind of Blake etchings, for example. But then when that doesn't happen, when the golden age of love doesn't transpire, people ask, well, why hasn't it happened? And that leads to the second mood, which is that someone or something is blocking us, an evil demonic cabal, them. So the second mood is one of kind of paranoid conspiracy. So conspirituality has long been an issue in Romanticism and the New Age. For example, the person who first introduced the notorious conspiracy theory, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, into Russian culture in the 1880s or 1890s was a theosophist, Juliana Glinka. So this has long been a problem in the New Age. But two things that have exacerbated these long-term trends. Firstly, the internet, which has made it easier for ideas to spread, good and bad, easier to hijack people's attention and limbic systems. And that's a problem for societies in general, not just for New Age culture. But secondly, the pandemic means that someone else's wacky beliefs about health affect everyone else much more. So New Age culture, in a way, was never going to do well in a pandemic. Surveys suggest that spiritual people like us are more likely to be anti-vax and suspicious of mainstream science. Although in our defense, we're also more likely to be worried about climate change than other religious groups. So we're not totally anti-science. So what can we do about it? Here are 5 suggestions. Firstly, the good news. The good news is that our culture has shown an immune response to spiritual disinformation. We may be in what Matthew Remski called a golden age for online charismatic influences, but it's also a golden age for calling out spiritual bullshit, like B. Schofield's work on tracking down and exposing gurus, or the Conspirituality podcast, which has been hugely popular. The internet means that abusive gurus may gain influence quicker, but they also get exposed quicker. Their shelf life is often much shorter. I've been encouraged to see spiritual leaders stepping up to counter disinformation and conspirituality, like the Association, like Jeff Krasno and Commune. I interviewed Stephen Dinan of the Shift Network, like Sean Korn in the yoga world. So many spiritual leaders have been stepping up to try and counter this phenomenon. In some ways, this era in New Age culture reminds me a bit of a kind of spiritual reformation, like in the kind of late Middle Ages, when people were calling out all the charlatanry and bullshit in the Catholic Church. It's almost become cool on Instagram to call out bullshit like bypassing or toxic positivity, neoliberal marketing, and so on. So you have people sharing kind of funny memes, just calling out these bad trends in spiritual culture. I give a shout out to my friend Adam Aronovich, who's a medical anthropologist, but also has a great Instagram account, Healing from Healing, with these kinds of funny memes about some of the bad trends in spiritual culture. So we're in a critical age, and that's okay. And we can try to model that in how we communicate and interview others. It's okay to ask questions and say, well, what exactly do you mean? Are you sure? Is there evidence for that? And I love Rick's interviews at Buddha at the Gas Pump, and the way he doesn't just go along with the mystic flow of his interviewees. He sometimes asks them hard questions as well. But the challenge at this critical time is how to balance the hermeneutics of suspicion with hope and a more positive vision, so we don't just get stuck in kind of cynicism and nihilism. There can be a temptation to just burn it all down, and I felt that myself in the last 18 months. So we still want to give people hope and useful practices to help them in difficult times. A second suggestion is just to look at the importance of epistemic trust. It's not easy to change a culture, particularly one that's so decentralized. Everyone thinks they're practicing critical thinking. Conspiracy theorists think they're the only ones doing critical thinking. It's not just an issue of rationality, but also of emotions, of what the British psychologist Peter Fonagy calls epistemic trust. So I didn't get vaccinated just because of my critical thinking, but also because of my trust in medical expertise. I don't fully understand how vaccines work, but I trust medical experts. So it was really a trust issue as much as a rationality issue. And we're at a moment where public trust is profoundly eroded because of the financial crisis, 2 failed wars, stagnating wages, problems with big pharma. So Peter Fonagy suggests that challenging pathological beliefs requires gaining trust in a therapeutic bond. Changing minds is probably as much, if not more, relational as it is rational. A third suggestion, we should emphasize that the great religious traditions see a crucial role for rationality, critical thinking, and philosophy. In Islam, intellect is the noblest human faculty. Likewise, in Greek philosophy, in Plato and Aristotle and the Neoplatonists, reason or nous is the godlike part of us. The Stoics strive to live according to reason. In Proverbs, you read, wisdom is supreme, therefore get wisdom. I know Phil and Rick can tell us about the importance of reason in Hindu and yoga traditions. In Tibetan Buddhism, you have a whole training in philosophical debate. It's a kind of almost a physical process there. You clap every time you make a point. So reason and faith were closely allied before the Enlightenment in Christianity. So we just have to think about how to balance the Socratic and the ecstatic once more. Aldous Huxley, who I've been researching, he said, which did more for Athens, the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle or the Maenads, this ecstatic ritual? And he concluded, both. We need the best of both worlds. So it's about balancing and integrating the rational and the ecstatic. Many spiritual traditions teach us to be wary of our automatic emotional responses. In Stoicism, for example, which inspired CBT and to some extent behavioral economics, teaches us to use the Socratic method to be wary of our automatic biases, like emotional reasoning or an optimism bias, or the halo effect, like just because someone's very charismatic, we believe everything they say, or the apocalyptic bias, which the New Age can be prone to. There's a similar idea in the Renaissance thinker Francis Bacon. He teaches us to be aware and wary of the idols of our mind, of assuming our intuitions are right. Someone may have wonderful mystical experiences, but that doesn't mean they know everything about everything. I recently met someone who'd had a great spiritual awakening, and he moved to a state of consciousness where everything was perfect, everything happened for a reason, everything was just right, and you should just surrender to it all. And there's a lot of wisdom in that attitude he'd attained, but I wouldn't put him in charge of a public health campaign. He was very skeptical of Western medicine, unvaccinated, and he got COVID twice. So there's such a thing as mystical ignorance as well as mystical wisdom. So in terms of discernment practices, what can religious traditions teach us? Well, they're hard. It's not clear cut. It's difficult to discern whether a mystical experience is valid or what aspects of it are valid. I recently read a historical book called Believe Not Every Spirit, looking at the history of discernment practices in the church. And what Sluchowski, the author, found is that in practice, medieval church practices on discernment were quite misogynist. If a man has a mystical experience, it might be valid. If a woman has a mystical experience, probably not. So discernment practices are difficult and not clear cut. But some good tips. Firstly, when you have a mystical experience, check in with your community, talk about it. Of course, that's hard if you're in a bubble. Secondly, you've got to check your intuition. Einstein talked about the importance of mystical sentiments, mystical experiences, but he still had to check his hypotheses, check if it actually, worked out factually, check for evidence. Part of that is predictive reasoning. Do your forecasts pan out? Mystics often made grand apocalyptic forecasts. Osho, for example, said that 1/3 of Americans were going to die of AIDS. Well, do they actually pan out in reality? In the New Age, there's often been these predictions of we're about to go into a kind of great awakening, a great shift, a harmonic convergence. There's this apocalyptic bias, but does it actually pan out historically? And finally, what are the fruits of your experience? This is something that Jonathan Edwards emphasized, the theologian in the 18th century, that William James emphasizes, that St. Paul emphasized in his letter to the Corinthians. Does your spiritual experience make you more loving and charitable? If it doesn't, then maybe it's just noise. And a final suggestion is just to be wary of sciencey statements. There's anti-science, but then there's kind of pseudoscience or sciencey kind of stuff. Like a lot of the times in spiritual culture now, you see people just glibly referring to one trial or one brain scan or one study and using that to make statements like, it turns out that, or we now know that, which is over certain. Border science is by nature speculative, and conclusions should be tentative and provisional. And spiritual science particularly is prone to the confirmation bias, because people are so emotionally invested in their practice, whether that's transcendental meditation or psychedelic therapy and so on. So my tentative conclusions are that the New Age needs not just pop preachers, but theologians in a way with a historical and critical perspective who are ready to grapple with difficult questions, like Ken Wilber in the early days, like Jorge Ferrer, institutions like CIIS or Esalen or the ASI. However, we are in an age of dramatic change and uncertainty, epistemic, systemic uncertainty. So it's likely to remain an age of charismatic influencers selling simplistic apocalyptic narratives for a good few years. So thank you, and there are my contact details, and I'll be happy to share the slides as well.
Thanks, Jules. I'm sure everybody found that incredibly valuable. Dan, do you want to take over?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Dan Wilson, and I don't have any slides for you today, but I'd like to just start by telling a story that will hopefully get back to current events. But the story I want to tell today is how I used to be a really hardcore believer in a lot of conspiracy theories. So, as Phil introduced in the beginning, I currently have my PhD in biological sciences, and I run a YouTube channel in my spare time where I talk about conspiracy theories having to do with anti-vaccine sentiments and COVID skeptics mostly. But I didn't always used to think like this. I used to really believe that 9/11 was an inside job, for example. And I kind of want to just walk you through my thought process, looking back now and as I see it through that journey. So about over 14 or 15 years ago now, I watched a documentary called Loose Change for the first time, which totally hooked me into this idea that 9/11 was an inside job. And looking back, I can see exactly how they did that. To me as a viewer, they were able to create this illusion of mystery, first and foremost. So what do I mean by illusion of mystery? They were able to paint this picture where there were so many unknowns about that specific event, about 9/11, and convince me that there was all this precedence to think that that mystery needed to be filled with some grand conspiracy. And that's exactly what they then did. They created this illusion of mystery where if you were to ask an expert about these questions, they would say, that's not really that mysterious. We've looked into it. We know how that works. But as a layperson, you might not know that. And so they just make you uncomfortable. They first make you really think that there's something that needs filled in, and then they fill it in with a really neat and tidy answer that fits all of these different pieces into this one picture. And this one picture of all these disparate pieces can be quite attractive. It can be a worldview where everything fits together. Everything fits into the conspiracy. No matter what happens, there's a reason for it. As Jules suggested, there could be a lot of wisdom spiritually in that mindset, but in a realistic worldview, when it comes to something like 9/11 or a pandemic, that doesn't really work. It doesn't all always fit together into one grand idea, in this case being a conspiracy. So I was hooked right away. I felt like I was getting in on some secret knowledge that no one else knew. And that helped it make sense to me. And not only that, but it created a common enemy, right? It created a they that we, the conspiracy theorists, are fighting against. And it felt good. It felt I would get a dopamine hit every time I went on a YouTube rabbit hole. I felt like I was learning so much and learning things that no one else just knew. I felt really special at the time. But being the person who liked to go on YouTube rabbit holes that I was, I also would engage with people. I would spend hours arguing with people in YouTube comment sections. I don't recommend doing that ever, but that's what I did at the time. And part of what that did for me was I ended up having long conversations with people who were patient enough to challenge my ideas. And that ended up helping me. I would end some arguments by just being uncomfortable. It's kind of the same way I was uncomfortable when I first watched that documentary that hooked me into the idea in the first place. But now, being ingrained in the belief, that discomfort was met with, oh, I must have missed something. There must be something I'm missing. I can't be wrong. But enough of those challenges that forced me to feel that uncomfortable feeling eventually left me just having to acknowledge, if I was being honest with myself, I had to acknowledge that this grand picture that I built in my mind, the pieces didn't actually fit together. The science didn't really check out. It wasn't really sound. And eventually I came out of those beliefs. Eventually I moved away from that. I went on to study molecular biology. I came more and more out of those ideas as I got further into learning how science works, and eventually earned my PhD. And now I still keep that passion of wanting to communicate with people. Just now I'm kind of on the other side. I don't subscribe to conspiracy theories. I don't consider myself anti-spiritual, though, not at all. And now I focus real heavily on trying to communicate with people who are just like me through my YouTube channel, who hear about something that is difficult to understand when it comes to vaccines or COVID. And that difficulty in understanding what they're hearing is filled in with neat, tidy conspiracy theories that are at their face value really attractive. So now that's what I do in my free time. And I think that now, kind of as Jules touched on, it's been a kind of golden age where so many different conspiracy theorists, influencers can rise to popularity really, really quickly. And we've seen that in the COVID pandemic. And I think that there's a pretty clear reason for that, at least to me. And the reason is that COVID as a pandemic has touched on so many different aspects of our lives. It's touched on literally everything, our jobs, our health, and every pandemic or every event that touches on such wide-reaching parts of our lives comes with a lot of misinformation, because people don't want their neat and tidy picture to be shaken. So they take this big, complicated event and try to fit it into their pre-existing worldview. We've seen this happen several times throughout recent history, especially with the AIDS pandemic. There was a ton of misinformation that came out surrounding the AIDS pandemic. And what did AIDS touch on? AIDS touched on our own health. It touched on sexuality. It touched on drug use. It touched on race. Because for so long, people were just not wanting to acknowledge that it was a threat. They didn't want to acknowledge that it was something that we had to care about as a community. First, it was called gay-related immune deficiency, GRID. No one wanted to acknowledge that it was something that heterosexual people could get. Then it was thought of as a gay or Haitian disease, thought that only gay people or Black people could get it. And that kind of just continued for a long time. People just didn't want to acknowledge it. And even to this day, there's a lot of misinformation about AIDS and HIV. So now fast forward to today, where we have another pandemic that is affecting literally every aspect of our lives. We had to go into lockdown. Many countries had to go into lockdown because of this. That's going to really shake things up. That's going to be really tough for people. So now if people using the internet, which wasn't nearly as established in the AIDS era as it is now, people can fill in those difficult, uncomfortable feelings with these grand conspiracies that just go viral incredibly quickly. And now we see the result of that. We see that there's just tons and tons of misinformation about COVID, seemingly new things every week that I struggle to keep up with on my YouTube channel. There's just so much content. And I just want to talk about for a little bit maybe how just explain why all this misinformation is difficult to both deal with for an average person, and just a little more on why it's doing such a good job of catching on. So from the very beginning of this pandemic, we've seen science deal with something that it never has had to deal with in the past. And that is an internet environment where ideas can spread so fast, so quickly. People want answers really, really quickly. But the pandemic is so quickly moving that it's really hard to satisfy that. And so what you end up with is you're watching science kind of in real time. Normally, what happens with science is people will spend months, years in their labs, having lab meetings, hashing out ideas. In graduate school, we would come up with one idea at a lab meeting 1 week where everyone was so excited about it. We thought that this was going to be the next big thing. And then 2 weeks later, when people do their experiments, they're like, well, it didn't really work out. That's not really what we thought. And all that usually happens behind closed doors until it gets published. And then people read about it, and then news sites will report on it, often badly. They report on it often inaccurately. But now we're seeing the whole process kind of intimately, right? As soon as there's an issue, scientists will have to have an answer. And it's not always going to be correct right off the bat. It's not always going to be one answer that stays the same throughout the whole pandemic. And science has had a really tough time of communicating through all of that process. And that difficulty in communicating leaves even more room for influencers and conspiracy theorists to fill that in with neat, tidy, comfortable answers. And I think that's a big reason why we see a lot of misinformation catching on these days. And there's no clear good answer as to how you as a normal person should deal with it. It just takes work. It takes branching out from your normal sources of news, or rather, I should say, it takes branching out from just one source of news, right? So just like how I had to challenge myself by talking to lots of different people as a conspiracy theorist, we have to branch out and challenge ourselves by listening to lots of different sources. It's not enough to just listen to Fauci or just listen to one influencer. You should, if you're serious about thinking critically through this pandemic and not falling prey to misinformation, it's not easy. You have to be vigilant and listen to lots of different scientists, lots of different good science communicators. And they're out there, they're doing their work. But the media probably isn't going to report very heavily on those individuals. So that's my message, is to stay vigilant and try your best to make sure you're challenging the claims. Make sure you're looking at the evidence as best you can. And when you can't look at the evidence yourself, just listen to scientists. Listen to scientists who understand the material, understand the literature, and are good at communicating it, because that's really your best bet. But I understand it's difficult, and all we can do is do our best, right? So it takes work. That's my parting message for this 20 minutes of talking. I hope you all enjoyed my story. It's one I've told on my channel before. I don't talk about it a ton, but it's one part of my journey that led me to being a passionate science communicator. So I hope that was useful. And if you want to contact me, my contact info is in the description of all of my videos on my YouTube channel, I do my best to answer messages and questions that people may have. So yeah, hope that helped.
Thank you, Dan. We appreciate it. I should add that your story reminded me that a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times daily podcast had a story on what they thought were the origins of conspiracy thinking in recent decades, and dated it back to all the conspiracy theories around 9/11 and that film you mentioned. So if people want to look into that further, it was fascinating. You probably find it on the New York Times archive somewhere. Okay, we're open for questions. I am now looking where
Well, since we've just heard from Dan, I just want to make a quick plug about his YouTube channel, Debunk the Funk. I have watched or listened to every single video he's made on there. And I just think it's a great source of information. And I'm not a scientist, so I don't remember a lot of the things he says, but as he's saying them, at least, I understand clearly what he's saying and how it contrasts with the bit of misinformation that he's debunking. So if you just search YouTube for Debunk the Funk with Dr. Wilson, you'll find it. Thanks.
Okay. David Doyle, please unmute yourself. And again, a reminder to everybody, we have two guests. Please ask them questions, and please be succinct. David?
So I'm interested in your views on this. Pretty much in all the traditions, when people start to meditate, they're asked to stop the monkey mind and basically to just stop, in a lot of ways, a lot of the mental inertias and cultural inertias that they have. And then that naturally, as that kind of progresses, they start questioning a lot of prior thinking and things like that and put that on hold or whatever. And one thing that I've noticed is a lot of times 3 to 5 years into it, people become teachers and they start becoming situated in some of the new certainties they have through intuition and things like that. But I have noticed that around 3 to 5 years into it, a lot of the new teachers really, the teaching itself has never asked the students to revisit their brains. There is monkey mind, but not, you don't want to really throw the baby out with the bathwater. And at the same time, certainly for the first year or so, a lot of times you're really asking the students, stop the constant automated habituation of thoughts. And then there's no real reintroduction. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on maybe how to deal with something like that. Thank you.
Well, I mean, shall I go first, Dan? So I'm not a meditation teacher, but we have some with us. So I will definitely be interested to what people in the group think. I guess there's a difference between, and I think you will know this better than me, David, between like that process of not being completely entranced by your automatic thoughts. There's a difference between learning to kind of be a bit detached from that flow of automatic thoughts, and then what you can get in some spiritual groups, which is this idea, just don't think at all, just turn off your mind completely, don't question at all. So you see that kind of difference, and I think we sometimes see that in spiritual groups, like leave your mind at the door of the dojo, or that kind of thing, or like just don't rely on your reason at all. So there's that, there's the balance, I guess, between just learning to be distanced from one's automatic thoughts, but not saying there's no benefit in rational thinking at all.
Yeah, I guess trying to add to that from a scientific perspective, we're always finding out new things and challenging our beliefs. That's really ideally what science should be about, is challenging hypotheses with experiments. And that's ideally relatively straightforward in the realm of science, but in the realm of spirituality, I guess it's more difficult to really like challenge beliefs with experiments, right? I don't know what the spiritual teachers would say about that, but um, as ideas evolve, just take what you can, I guess, from the scientific approach and try to make sure that you're always challenging things, at the least asking, does this work for me? Does this work for those around me? That's really all I can say to that. I'm interested to hear what other spiritual teachers would have to say about that, though.
I would say that in all my years of research and in my training, I have never come across a respected lineage of teachers that would not agree with what Jules said about balancing the rational and the non-rational aspects of the mind. This one thing, and they would say that, you know, what David termed quieting the monkey mind would be an asset to discernment and rational thinking, not something opposed to it. But somehow I often see these teachings about the limits of the intellect and the limits of the rational mind being taken to an extreme of abandoning rational thought or degrading rational thought, whereas the classic yogis and the Buddhist masters, they understand we are blessed with faculties of intuition and faculties of direct knowing and of transcendence of the mind, and also of the use of the mind and the intellect in rigorous ways. They're not necessarily contradictory in my understanding. Does anybody else want to comment on that before I move on to the next question? Okay, Valorous, did I pronounce it right? Valoris?
Yeah, Valoris, yes, correct. I've kind of been on a spiritual journey for most of my adult life, and over the past 2 years, I in the beginning of COVID, I kind of I was following a lot of wellness people, and I fell into the anti-COVID, anti-vax ideologies. And I don't know what happened to me, but something just didn't feel right. And so I just started doing more research, and I came to the conclusion that science obviously is real, and I want to partake in this and to not only help myself, but help others. But overall, I just want to say conspirituality is new to me, and I feel kind of paralyzed within my spiritual beliefs and like wanting to discard it altogether. And I'm just wondering, I guess, what's a good way for me to start critically thinking about things, and maybe like books that I could read or a book that I could read to help assist in learning how to critically think and also have spirituality in my life. Thank you.
Jules or Dan want to comment?
Dan, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. Yeah, so I kind of relate to that, where, you know, back when I was up to my neck in belief in conspiracy theories, I also, you know, bought into a lot of conspirituality stuff. And coming out on the other side, it was like, what do I do with these beliefs. So I totally understand what you're saying there. And now I said I wasn't anti-spiritual, not at all. And, I still find parts of my life where I can be spiritual. And for me personally, it comes mostly through loss, loss of loved ones, that sort of thing, where um, I allow myself room to grieve by being more spiritual, by, for example, talking to them when they're gone, just to help myself get through that grief. I don't stop myself and think critically like, oh, well, they can't hear me. They, there's no afterlife. Like I don't stop and think those things. I just allow myself to say, maybe there is, maybe there's something, maybe, or at the very least, just acknowledge that this is what's helping me feel better right now. And I don't build like some grand thing around it. I just say, this is what's helping me. And this is my spirituality as it is right now. And that's what matters. I would never suggest someone to get rid of something like that, especially if it helps them so much. So just on a personal level, I think that's what I would say to that in a conversation with you.
And I would, add to that I definitely relate as well. I found it hard these last 18 months, really dispiriting. And I sometimes, and along with everything else, we're in a pandemic as well, and that's hard too. But to see my culture feels like it's failing a test, and it's disenchanting. And I've sometimes felt nihilist as well. Like, well, what do I believe if I, if not this kind of thing? And there's that, feeling of like the bottom dropping out of one's world, and it's bewildering. So one thing I would say is that is, the spiritual journey is like that sometimes. Like, it's for some reasons the spiritual and religious field sometimes attracts sociopathic teachers. It always has, hypocrites and charlatans. Just look at, writers in the kind of Middle Ages, like Chaucer or something, and they would laugh at the kind of the friar who, preaches celibacy and then is caught, having some hanky panky constantly, or the selling indulgences or that kind of thing. So it's often been a test, and it's often been dispiriting. And in the history of discernment and writing about it, they talk about testing metals. Is this gold, or is this just dross? And so it involves that uncertainty. And one thing we can do is go back to the classics, and be a little bit wary of the new thing, or the kind of the new guru. So, like going to the primary sources, like Marcus Aurelius or the Dhammapada, or good scholars now writing about those primary sources from kind of, reputable universities, say. And then emotionally, it's just also about kind of learning to tolerate uncertainty. Like, when we don't always have to have clear answers immediately, and that means tolerating difficult emotions as well. But like Dan, I mean, I'm not just a critic. That's what I talked about, balancing suspicion and criticism with kind of hope and a more positive vision. And I've definitely had a lot of enormous benefit in my life from spiritual practices, and I've had spiritual experiences which I don't fully understand, but they've been very helpful in my life. So I'm I think you can be a spiritual agnostic, like not totally certain, but these practices have been helpful for me. These teachings have been helpful for me. Is it making me more kind? The real basic stuff.
Thank you both. I see a hand. Catherine Schultz.
Hey, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, good. So this is just wonderful presentation. I did my PhD in the subject of bliss and how do we socially organize in it. So I've been vexed with these questions for about, I think 25 years or something like that. And so I love this blend between the personal experience, rich experience of the interface with the culture, and then the big picture. And the two things that have always really stuck with me with Ken Wilber's work is the Wilber-Combs lattice. I don't know if you're familiar with Alan Combs, who's a friend of mine, but they figured out that people would have these spiritual experiences, but then they would interpret those experiences with where they were at with their personal belief systems and their personal structures and how they saw the world. And psychology has done this great job in so many different ways with looking at personalities and evolution of them. Like, so what I love about your story, Dan, and I was wanting to possibly ask or see if you could share a little bit more, is that if you have this experience, these experiences, and then you're trying to make sense of the world, that we're dealing with, you have your first person paths to God, which is what's within you, and their self-inquiry. And so many teachers are fabulous around use your mind well for inquiry for your first person. And then there's this amazing ways that scientists have woken up studying the universe using critical thinking with the rational mind of the third person path of looking at subject and object and separating out. But we are in the midst of the most tumultuous phase of our species with the second person path, which has been all about devotion and connection and trust with the other person. And if you take your experience and then you go back to your tribe, your cultural mirror will be at a certain evolutionary point. And so unless the bubbles are popped, and as Ken Wilber says, if we can get our species to go enough into holding multiple points of view, and that would be in the emotional body, the mental bodies, all these aspects of ourselves, if we can move these lines up for evolution enough, we could have a critical mass. But it's an evolutionary second person thing where it's so murky because I was curious, did you encounter the way people encountered you with conflict? That seemed to be the better way that pushed you for evolution because you also cared, you know, and so my sense, and I'm wondering, Dan, did you meet people who were maybe more inclusive but challenged you enough to move into a new headspace, a new way of being? Well, you shifted your evolution. Wilber will say too, it could take 5 years to move for a person, but this time is so charged in the second person space. It again makes me wonder if we can get this right somehow with, like you said, the limbic system, Julian.
Catherine, I'm going to interrupt because there was a question in there directed at Dan. So I'd like to, let him respond.
Okay, thanks.
Sure, yeah. So people challenging me was, as I said, definitely a big part of me coming out of those beliefs. And I think the important part, looking back on it, was just the fact that they took the time to actually have a long back and forth with me. And now when I try to figure out how I can improve what I do on my channel and have more conversations with people, which is one thing I'm trying to do more of on my channel, how to actually do that. And one of the ways I keep seeing coming up being suggested is to just listen. Like when you're talking with family members at Thanksgiving who might have a few interesting things to say, just, listen, give them the time of day to let them know you're understanding them, that you are not just dismissing them, that you're not thinking they're crazy, but really listen and establish a relationship and then have a back and forth. Now, in my case, most of my interaction was through YouTube comments. So I don't know how much you want to call that a relationship, but it was still something, you know. I would literally be up at 1 a.m. Watching my inbox, waiting for the reply to come so I could read it and respond. And it was just, you know, if they stopped talking to me, then I would be like, oh, well, they just couldn't answer my question. So they quit and I won. So it's really that patience, I think, that helped me the most at least in my experience. So hopefully that answers the question.
Jules, did you want to say anything?
No, I think that's very interesting to me. I mean, I think we're all trying to figure out, how do you change minds? How do you persuade people in disagreements and arguments? And it is really hard. And a lot of people just don't have the patience. So yeah, I interviewed, or I had a conversation with Jeff Krasner of Commune recently. He was talking about over the pandemic, he's had these long Zoom calls with people, but it takes ages and to gain that trust. And then the patience, and then bit by bit, kind of talk point by point. So it just sounds like slow work. So I really applaud you for doing that, Dan.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing. It's the reason you don't see a lot of scientists with a ton of patience is because, well, they're caught up in a lot of other things. Catherine, you said you did a PhD, you know how academia is. For example, I started my YouTube channel just before I graduated, just before I earned my PhD, because I knew I wanted to start doing that. And I figured, why wait? So eventually my advisor found out that I was doing that, and they were very kind of backhanded about it. Like, oh, well, is that going to be cutting into your experiment time? How much time are you going to spend away from the bench because you're doing this YouTube thing? It's like, well, it's a weekend project. I can do it on the weekend. It's not cutting into my time at all, but it's perceived a certain way in academia. When you're doing extra things, you're not spending that time at the bench. You could be doing more at the bench. So the scientific community, academia, I think, is not super accepting of that attitude of just being patient with people and engaging with them and really taking the time to explain these things. So but I think it is changing slowly. I think it is changing. So keep that in mind when you're looking for good science communicators, that it's tough for them to come away from their work and feel like they're not being thought less of for it.
Okay. Richard Kurth has a hand up. Richard?
Yeah, hi, thank you. I guess I'm trying to distill this into a succinct question, and I will in just a second. My own experience is, in my work, I'm not going to change anybody. What I can do is help to create an environment and challenging questions where the change comes from them. So I can't work with something they don't have. I can't posit a higher or some other way of looking at it if it's not something coming from them. So this question of discernment, and I really wanted to ask Jules this question. All of these things are mainstream. I mean, helping professors, psychotherapy, meditation teachers, coaching, the list goes on and on. These are not obscure corners, as has been pointed out. This is a mainstream thing that's infected with lots of different things. The question is, and of course, without a whole lot of attention to lineage, what's been done before, and I think Jules referred to the lineage, you can really see the history of what discernment is and how to do it if you care to look. I guess the question is, for me, an acid test would be, what's the hustle? I mean, Jules referred to hustling before, and we all hustle. You know, can we learn to recognize a hustle? And to me, a hustle is something where I don't have the ability to openly question who I'm working with. If I do, I will get shut down, diverted, brought back into the fold, whatever it may be. So for me, that's always the test is, let's accept people are hustlers. I'm not saying they aren't, but if I really want to get to grips with it, I have to know what the hustle is so I can see where this person is going to go. Does that question make any sense to you, Jules, as an acid test in this world?
Yeah, I think it does. You can look at how they communicate.
Yeah.
Do they overhype their wares? I'm watching, I'm kind of a sucker for cult documentaries. I don't know why, I just kind of fascinated by them. So I'm watching this HBO one at the moment called The Vow, about Nixim, I think it's called. And it just strikes me like there's something kind of useful in their teachings initially, but it's like, it's stoicism. It's that your reality is constructed by your beliefs, your emotions contain beliefs, and you can change your emotions by changing beliefs. So much of self-help teaching is just that basic insight from Stoicism and Stoicism and Buddhism, but often repackaged as if it's this incredible new insight that you can only find in like Landmark education, or which is another kind of hustler, or in Nixim or somewhere else, or in Scientology. And, I remember I went on a Landmark course and they said, no, humans have been messed up for millennia, but now we have discovered the new technique. So that should be a red flag, hyping wares with this new insight. Lineage, which is something Phil talked about as well. Yeah, but also things like, what's your training, like particularly in, say, therapy. Boards can be useful. I think psychedelic therapy, they're going to have to look at some kind of certified board with some agreed table of ethics, for example, because that space is so liminal. Psychedelic therapy, there's so much room for abuse there and overstepping boundaries. So is this therapist accredited and so forth? But I mean, I think again, there's the balance between the suspicion and also hope as well, and search for more positive opinion. Like sometimes when I criticize a spiritual teacher, people say, what's your agenda? Where are you coming from? So you can take that line of thinking too far as well. Like, oh, you must have an angle, that kind of thing. So it's that balance between healthy skepticism, but also sometimes like, yeah, maybe this person has something to teach me. The person I was talking about, who says he has a spiritual awakening, even he is not vaccinated, doesn't really believe in Western medicine. And so I could completely discount him, but he does have interesting things to teach me. And what I like about this person is he's rubbish at marketing. I like that. He hasn't built a massive charismatic influencer platform. So this is discernment. It's never cut and dry. I have never met a spiritual teacher who's like 100% just excellent all the way and knows everything about everything. It's always a bit of a kind of weighing up, and I like this aspect of their teachings, but maybe that bit I don't agree with.
Very good. Thank you, Jules, sorry. I see a hand from David Spector. David, unmute.
Hi. I've had two unsettling experiences recently relative to critical thinking. One is that I spent about a month or two watching videos on YouTube about physics, which is an area that I know something about. I have some education in. And the physics presentations generally on YouTube have been excellent. All of the technical presentations on YouTube are really good. But the comments, it's amazing that about half of the comments are, I really like this, it's really helped me, which is fine. But then about a quarter of the comments were, I have come up with my own understanding, which shows that all the scientists are wrong. And if they would only listen to me, they would have no further questions. And it all comes down to electromagnetism, which is, from the standpoint of physics, nonsense. Their electromagnetism does account for a lot of phenomena, but it doesn't account for quantum mechanics. It doesn't account for dark matter. It doesn't account for dark energy and lots of other things. So, and I've gotten into personal discussions with these people in the comment section, and I discovered that they're not open to learning. They're not open to any kind of change in their fixed opinions. And it just says to me that we're missing something in our education institutions, in our school systems. There should be some explicit teaching of how to think critically. The other experience that I had was that I belong to a very wonderful non-duality discussion group. They're very civil with each other. We enjoy each other. We have a high level of expertise in the subject matter, and so we love talking with each other. But I had a private conversation with the leader of the group, and I discovered that he's against vaccination. He has doubts about the pandemic, whether it actually exists. And I followed up his references, and there was room for some doubt in the references, but then I found other references that removed those doubts using really good statistical arguments. And he was unwilling to listen to anything that I had to say. He just wanted to give me more and more evidence, all of which was really bad evidence.
But David, I'm going to interrupt because in the interest of time, if you could frame a question
that's the problem. I wanted to somehow tie it back to all the scandals that we see with spiritual teachers, because this is something that isn't good for spiritual knowledge. It's not good for spiritual teachers. And it's something that I think that ASI will be increasingly involved with. We need, if there isn't critical ability to critically think on the part of the spiritual teachers, we need to learn how to counsel them. We need to learn how to talk with them so that we can get them to moderate some of their views where necessary, so that abuses don't have a bed to grow in, if I can put it that way. I don't have a specific question for either of the speakers. I thought they were excellent speakers.
Thank you, then. I would suggest that we table the question of working with spiritual teachers on these matters for subsequent conversations, because we only have about 10 minutes left. And I've gotten 3 messages from someone in the chat room, very eager to ask a question of Jules, so I'm going to read it. This is from Marin Aspat. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And Marin asks Jules, I would like to hear Jules' thoughts regarding fundamentalism within the New Age or spiritual community. It seems like he was describing a fundamentalist bent and maybe something approaching a cult. Jules, do you want to address that? And then we'll have about 10 minutes for any remaining questions. I'd like to get Rick's question in. Jules, you're muted.
sorry, one can certainly see aspects of spiritual fundamentalism, and that's been the case for decades. It was one of the kind of tragic ironies of the 60s and 70s that spiritual seekers looking for liberation sometimes lost years and years in basically totalitarian cults, where they, these freedom seekers ended up having to completely submit and obey to the dogma, and you can spot them still by, they'll just almost just repeat the same, sound bites over and over and catchphrases. But another point that interests me at the moment is I've been struck in the last 2 years by how the similarities between New Age culture and evangelical Christianity. And you would think that these two cultures couldn't be more different. And yet you see the same kind of apocalyptic thinking, battling demons, but we are the children of light. You even see this new thing of like talking in tongues in New Age culture. It's called light language. So, and that's interesting to me. And of course, because, the apple doesn't fall far from the fruit. And a lot of people leaving evangelical churches, but they're taking all their evangelical tendencies with them. So it's something I'm just learning about now, really. And yeah, I don't know if people have thought the same thing.
Well, I have found fundamentalist tendencies even in the scientific community. So extremism doesn't seem to have any bounds, and fanaticism. Rick, you had a comment, question.
Yeah, quick comment, and I think maybe Dan might have a response to this, and that is that in traditional, and you would know this well too, Phil, that in spiritual traditions such as Hinduism and Buddhism, it was very common to have public debates, and very cordial, deep public debates, not like the little sound bites and whatnot that we get in today's political debates. And it would be a sporting event. I mean, the big audiences would collect, and sometimes the loser would become the disciple or student of the winner, and so on. And I just feel like, we're so siloed in today's culture, as we know, and, Fox News is saying one thing and MSNBC is saying another thing. And you've probably all seen The Social Dilemma. We get reinforced in our biases by social media. The algorithm is designed to do that to us. And I would just like to see the upsurge or restoration of that old tradition of, let's have Anthony Fauci get up on a stage with, Mickey Willis or somebody and have a well-moderated debate, and I think that probably somebody like Fauci would say, well, I don't want to dignify this guy by doing that. But the problem is that everybody just, they stay in their silos. And if two contrasting views like that were publicly viewable by millions of people, I think that would do a lot to shift people's minds. I doubt it. Irene says, I doubt it. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I totally see the opposition to that, the not wanting to give these people a stage or kind of lend credibility to their argument by entertaining it on a debate stage. I get that, but like you're saying, the alternative is to have them stay in their silos or in their bubbles, if you will. And I think what we're seeing with COVID is that approach isn't really working. Thankfully, in most places, vaccination rates are going up. And in the first year, the numbers all look really good. But in a place like America, where we have so many resources and we're kind of plateauing around like just below 70% eligible vaccinated, there's no excuse for that final third to not be vaccinated yet. And I think that's kind of a product of the bubble of misinformation, often their own silo, just growing, and not being exposed properly to the kinds of things that will properly challenge them. And so I'm for that. I'm for that idea of having someone like Fauci debate Mickey Willis. I think that would be kind of hilarious, but it's something I'm trying to do on my channel, at least, where we talk with people. I talk with people and just try to challenge their ideas by listening to them and bringing up specific things. Yeah, I think there is value in that kind of discourse, because otherwise the misinformation bubble will just grow and they'll hunker down and they'll say, oh, what's that? Snopes is bought, Reuters is bought, all those fact checkers are bought, don't trust them. And it's a lot easier to say that when they're off over there in their own bubble. It's a lot harder to say that when you're faced with these people you're talking about. So I do think there's value there, but it has to be done. It has to be done carefully,
Good.
People will take those sound bites from a debate and possibly misrepresent them. I think that's a valid concern.
Jules, do you want to comment on that? We have a few minutes left.
Not really. I guess it's an issue that Rick has to kind of grapple with, and anyone who has, and Dan as well, who has a kind of online platform. Who do you platform? Is there a risk you're just giving oxygen to, extremist views? I was invited onto a podcast to talk about Stoicism, and it turned out to be a white supremacist podcast. Some of the organizers of the Charlottesville rally, and they were into Stoicism as well. And I thought probably better not to go onto that podcast. So yeah, no, I don't have much to add, but.
We have a few minutes left. There's a lot of comments in the chat room that we just don't have time to convert them into questions for our guests. And so I would encourage everybody to take a look at what's being discussed there. I would invite Jack, who's with us now. We have a few minutes. Do you want to say anything, Jack, on behalf of ASI, make any announcements, comments, or whatever? I thought you should have that opportunity.
Thanks, Phil. I teach my day job on Sunday mornings, and so I was missing for the first part of it. I think we're scratching the surface of something that's critically, foundationally important for our sector. I hear many spiritual teachers saying it's kind of hopeless the way society is going now, and that saddens me, because I think the more active we can become, surely action is what hope is really about, and that each of us engages better tools, better skills, encouraging ourselves to embrace our shadow, to welcome our blind spots, because truly, if we deny our blind spots, there's no growth, there's no human evolution at all. And so if in any way the ASI can hold space for teachers to look at how we're not thinking critically, where our biases lie, if we can hold that platform, I think we're making a difference. And different ways to do that is an exploration. Sometimes we're going to get it wrong, and sometimes we might hit the nail on the head, but we're going to give it a shot, because action really is what's needed, and each of us can participate in that.
Great, thank you, Jack. Jules, Dan, thank you very much on behalf of ASI, all the members and the board. Thanks for giving us your time. Thanks for the work you do. If you would, I was just going to invite you both to put your contact information or how people, or your websites or anything in the chat. Dan just did. Jules, you're welcome to as well, so people could learn more about your work. And if you're open to it, contact you. So please, everybody, all the members, we apologize if we couldn't get all your questions in, but I hope you found this of value. And please let us know what you thought. Please give us suggestions for future webinars and anything else you'd like to communicate. So with that, if there's no more comments from Rick or Jack or David or Suzanne, then thank you all. Keep thinking, and then don't think, and then think again.